Cannabis. Chronicling the latest cannabis industry news and headlines. Welcome to the State of Cannabis. Bringing you fact-based news and views and keeping listeners on the pulse of what's happening in the industry today. Advocates and analysts will join us to discuss the ongoing path to reform and legislation. Now, the State of Cannabis. With your host, Dave Inman.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the State of Cannabis. I'm your host, Dave Inman. We're in the middle of midterm elections. That's definitely an important topic. On the docket, we have four different measures that we're looking at. We've got Oregon Ballot Measure 91. We have Alaska Ballot Measure 2, both of which are for tax and regulate. We also have Washington, D.C. Initiative 71. Basically, it's kind of a legalization, just a really full-on decriminalization. And also, we have Florida Amendment 2, which effectively would be their medical marijuana initiative. Tonight, we have with us Attorney Jeffrey Feiler, founder and CEO of GrassRoots Ventures. Jeffrey, how are you today?
Very well. How are you today?
Like I said, it's the dawn of All Hallows Eve. We have 5 days until our election. What can you tell us about the Florida initiative, and how important is that initiative for Florida?
Well, it's a little spooky and a little scary because nobody knows exactly how it's going to turn out. Right now, it's polling very, very close, and I think a lot depends upon voter turnout as to whether it'll reach the 60% mark, which is what's required to pass the constitutional amendment at this point.
Constitutional amendments are kind of interesting. I'm in Phoenix, and for our medical bill, we actually had a voter initiative. And that's a little bit different. It seems like the further west you get, the more the people can change rather than it go through the legislation. Would that be a kind of a correct paraphrase?
Well, what happened in Florida was since 2012, the legislature has been presented with various opportunities to legislate medical marijuana legislation. And the legislation has always died in committee. None of the legislation basically ever came out or even had a chance to be voted on. So finally, the folks in Florida decided that, well, if the legislature is not going to act on this important issue, that the people need to act. And the way that the people act in Florida, in the absence of the legislature, is to put a referendum on the ballot and try to pass a constitutional amendment.
So you say it's a slim margin so far, and in Arizona we had about 4,000 votes that separated ourselves from not having our medical bill. Early ballots. You guys have early ballots, I'd assume, in Florida?
Yes, we have early voting and absentee ballot voting, but nothing. It has either been counted or made public in terms of what is the count at this point.
Well, and the funny thing is that I found out during Prop 203 here is that the early ballots that are turned in on the day of election get counted last. And so a lot of us, it was our first year for those the early ballots. I found that a large majority of us that had signed up to get specifically those turned them in late, probably to about the tune of 4,000 votes. So, everybody, if you do have early ballots, they're called early for a reason. Get them in the mail.
Right. The absentee ballots actually were available up until yesterday, Wednesday at 5 p.m. And so there are still going to be absentee ballots coming in pretty much all the way up to the date of the election. But in addition to that, we have early voting, where we have basically in libraries and city halls and places like that, not the 800 precincts, that'll be open, but there are just several places here and there. But voting is really easy. There's no lines. It's very quick, and that's been going on since the 20th. But again, we're not going to see those results until election night.
So you were involved with Colorado's recent laws. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I'm an attorney licensed to practice both in Florida as well as Colorado, and I have an office in Boulder, Colorado. Back in 2009, when the federal government first came out with their Ogden Memorandum, which is the Department of Justice and U.S. Attorney General Holder's instruction to the U.S. attorneys around the country that if folks were operating lawfully and there was lawfully in terms of state law, and that there was a robust system of enforcement, that the federal government was not going to allocate law enforcement and prosecutorial assets to arrest and prosecute folks. At that point, Colorado, which already had a constitutional amendment since about 2001, at that juncture, the climate changed, and Colorado essentially became ripe to forward the cannabis industry. In so doing, during 2010, House Bill 10-1284 in Colorado took essentially a 1 or 2 page constitutional amendment, fortified it with about 150 to 170 pages of legislation, spelling out all of the rules that the state wanted folks to follow, and then also paving the way for the local governments to make their rules and regulations, and the Department of Revenue to create the Marijuana Enforcement Division and to create all their administrative rules, and thus the whole system began in Colorado.
So basically made a framework for what's really going to be happening as far as a constitutional amendment?
Right, and because Colorado started from a constitutional amendment, Florida, in many ways, when it wrote their constitutional amendment, took a lot of the ideas, the general basic ideas, out of the Colorado constitutional amendment, or it looks, very similar in many ways, I should say. And for us, the constitutional amendment here in Florida would be the starting point that had been passed originally in Colorado. We fully expect that once the amendment passes, that there would either be rules and regulations by the Department of Health, or during the legislative session, which runs from March till May of 2015, but all within this 6-month period, that the initial rules and regulations are promulgated for down here.
You have a law office as well in Boulder. Recently on Tuesday, there was a raid by DEA and Denver police, and it appeared that there was some cross-state line trafficking that was going on. Have you heard anything about that?
Well, not about that in particular, but that really highlights continuing memorandums to the United States attorneys that have come out consistently since 2009. For example, the more recent memorandums have been called the Cole memorandums. And since 2013 and again in 2014, those memorandums set forth about 8 different criteria that the federal government is not going to tolerate, and in those instances, it's likely that they would prosecute folks. I believe that the number 1 on that list is that you cannot traffic illegal cannabis. You cannot move cannabis across state lines. So, in those instances, and they're few and far between because the vast majority of licensed folks have worked so hard to get their licenses that they're not going to jeopardize them by doing something illegal. But occasionally, a licensed enterprise crosses the line, and when that happens, it's fair game, and task force do sometimes step in.
Much like if a bar decided to open up to all ages.
That's right, or for some reason somehow was unlawfully shipping things, or breaking the law in some way.
Absolutely. So, that's an interesting point. Looking over the Oregon Measure 91 and Alaska's Measure 2, they both had the term non-commercial exchange. What would be your take on a non-commercial exchange?
In terms of Colorado or Florida, I have never contemplated anything like a non-commercial exchange. I mean, the only exchange might be in the context of one company. If, let's suppose, a growing operation couldn't fulfill its obligations, they were able to get a certain percentage of their product from another company, but that wouldn't even be an exchange. So that language is just not something that I've ever seen in Colorado, and I've not seen it in Florida.
4 different really good measures. Just to say them again, we've got Oregon Ballot Measure 91, Alaska Ballot Measure 2, Washington, D.C. Initiative 71, and Florida's Amendment 2 for medical marijuana. Earlier, I had mentioned you're also the founder and CEO of GrassRoots Ventures, founded in 2013. What is GrassRoots Ventures?
Well, GrassRoots Ventures basically is a combination of 2 concepts. One is entrepreneurial, involving dispensaries and growing operations, extraction operations, and so forth, which would operate generally in the industry. And the other side is Grassroots for a Cure Foundation, a nonprofit foundation, and essentially that we would use some of the money from ventures to operate the foundation, and in conjunction with some other foundations, such as I've spoken with folks from epilepsy and Parkinson's and cancer and so forth, really try to develop cannabis-based medications and do whatever research can be done, because as you may know, the climate to do scientific research presently on cannabis-based medications is virtually impossible at this moment. So, on the one hand, while we want to be entrepreneurial, at the same time, we firmly believe that the cannabis plant is of cannabinoids that are going to lead to wonderful medications at some point in the future, that we want to be part of that effort to make that happen.
So 32 years, 6 months. You'll have to forgive me. I was poking around on your LinkedIn. 32 years, 6 months as an attorney and cannabis too now. Was it because of the medical benefits? Did you maybe have a friend or family member that you saw a change in? Personally, I've always been more of the recreational type. A lot of people that seem to get off of prescription drugs, they seem to be able to walk a little more upright, be able to get themselves out of their fog. So what was it that brought you to cannabis?
What happened for me so far as medical marijuana was concerned, in Colorado back in 2009, when prospect of laws permitting medical marijuana, because remember what they now call retail and what everyone else calls recreational marijuana, was not a thought. So the question that sort of dawned on myself and my daughter, who had gotten her MBA and had moved to Colorado, was a conversation having to do with medical marijuana and the realization, truly as a medication, as a remedy, that this was something that could really help people. And my daughter and I are both of the type and of the mind that was a very important thing. She has been involved and has given away a great deal of medication to folks who can't afford it. It's one of the tenants that come into the stores. We had a conversation at one point. If we were going to open a store, where would we have a store? And it's like we didn't want one across the street from the university, because that wasn't what medical marijuana was about. And if you look at the patients that go into the stores, a lot of times, probably the average age is mid-40, and many of the patients are considerably older. So it's not so much about people just coming in to get weed and get high, as those folks really, really needed medications, and the various strains really, truly were helping them. That was our realization from the start, and that's something that I'm carrying through to Florida.
Beautiful thing that you're doing. We're going to take a quick break. When we get back, medical versus recreational. Right back at you in a few, folks.
Stay tuned for more State of Cannabis, only on CannabisRadio.com when we return.
Your connection to quality cannabis insurance services is spelled K-A-E-R-C-H-E-R. That's Karcher Insurance. We have worked with ventures like Cannabis for over 60 years. We're proud to represent over 50 companies with tailor-made cannabis plans for owners just like you to insure your product, your plants, and your pursuits. K-A-E-R-C-H-E-R spells out their full-service insurance services, ranging from commercial to bonds, to personal, from life to health, and more. Contact the team at KarcherInsurance.com and let our experience work for you. That's K-A-E-R-C-H-E-R Insurance.com.
Contact Karen and a team at Karcher Insurance at 1-844-421-3560. That's 844-421-3560.
Hi, I'm Montel Williams. Most of you know me as a talk show host, but I'm also an author, actor, single father of 4, avid snowboarder, and I'm also a medical marijuana patient. Living with multiple sclerosis, I'm in pain every day. Medical marijuana is my last resort, and it helps me when all other drugs have failed. If you'd like more information about medical marijuana, you can contact the Marijuana Policy Project at mpp.org or call 1-877-JOIN-MPP.
Chronicling the latest cannabis industry news and headlines. Welcome back to the State of Cannabis, only on CannabisRadio.com. Once again, here's Dave Inman.
Welcome back to the State of Cannabis, folks. I'm Dave Inman. Tonight we have with us attorney Jeffrey Feiler. founder and CEO of GrassRoots Ventures, as well as GrassRootsForACure.com, a nonprofit organization we'll have him talk about here in just a minute. Medical versus recreational. How do you feel about the two?
We see in Colorado that two separate initiatives took place several years apart. First one, which was medical in June of 2010, and then this year, essentially January of 2014, that the retail, or what people call recreational marijuana, came on in Colorado. And, that was a choice of the voters in Colorado. And as far as I'm concerned, this country should be governed by the will of the people. And if the will of the people is such that that's what they wanted, they certainly should have, and that's what they got. The reassuring thing is that we've heard no horror stories. It's been the better part of a year now. It has not turned into reefer madness. In terms of things like domestic violence and so forth and so on, police officers tell me that if they come to the house and somebody's drunk, there's a pretty good chance that there's a domestic violence and somebody's getting arrested. But if they go to the house and they've been smoking pot, there's just no violence going on. It's not a drug that makes people violent.
Tell me, looking over your website, it looks like you have a pretty extensive knowledge of cannabis in general, whether it be horticulture, distribution, setting up franchises, the strains, how they can benefit you.
Well, I think the most important thing to understand is that the Cannabis sativa L plant, and the flowers and buds of which are considered marijuana, and that's where the highest concentration of cannabinoids are, is that it's essentially all about cannabinoids. There's approximately 80 different cannabinoids. There's hundreds of strains of Cannabis sativa L. So in any one given strain, you're not going to have all the cannabinoids, but you're going to have them in different proportions to each other. Some of the most prominent ones are going to be THC-A, which is the acid form of THC, which is not psychoactive. In other words, you could juice it, you could eat it, you're not going to get high. It can be CBV, CBN, and other forms of THC, THCV, and so forth. What ends up happening is that in some plants, and you've heard such terms as Charlotte's Web and Haley's Hope and others, that there's a synergy of the various cannabinoids in that particular plant, which creates something called an entourage. When the synergy comes together and forms the right entourage, then at that point, folks who are using it seem to discover across the board that it's helping them in some particular way. At that point, it's considered to be a medication. And folks who have been working with this for a while, the various plant genetics, so as to try to increase the CBD or increase some other cannabinoid or what have you, some other portion of the plant that they hope would work, and the folks who are using it, give feedback that it's getting better or getting worse. So it's really hit and miss and kind of feel it out right now. But what we don't have is the opportunity to do real research at this juncture. So it's all sort of anecdotal. We know that it's working. We know that it's been working for 6,000 years. In order to refine it to exactly what works is the next step.
What do you think the next step is going to be?
Well, the way that it'll evolve, that research will be done more anecdotally, than anything else, but by ways that don't violate the various FDA and DEA and NIDA mandates. Nevertheless, patients will report, universities will do studies, and the larger, more scientific studies will lead to certain, if this country becomes enlightened and permits, the real scientific studies with placebos and double blinds and 1,000-person studies and so forth and so on, then it will move, into an era where real cannabis medications can be developed. But that's going to happen, and I believe that it may take a few years to get there, but we're on the right track and we're moving that way.
Well, and essentially, if cannabis was moved into Schedule 2, for instance, all of those tests were very easy to have done. You'd probably have, doctors over at Ole Miss, their samples for them to be able to test. But really, that's the linchpin, isn't it? The Schedule 2.
Well, right now in California, in the federal court, there's an evidentiary hearing going on pretty much as we speak. There's a challenge as to whether it's constitutional to consider marijuana to be. I've been following it, intermittently, but basically I'm seeing that the evidence that seems to be coming in off the witness stand seems to pretty clearly indicate that cannabis has medicinal benefits, that it's ludicrous to consider it to be a Schedule I substance by definition, which would have no medical benefit whatsoever. Cocaine, for example, is a Schedule II substance because it's considered to have some medicinal benefits. And with 23 states and more on the way having medical marijuana laws in place, it's just an outdated, outmoded, and incorrect concept to have it as a Schedule I substance. And I believe that at some point it's going to change. I mean, I really applaud that judge out in California, taking a look at it.
With California's medical law, I mean, it's almost like it's swept the nation in really a relatively short amount of time. I mean, if we were to look at the scope and length and breadth of prohibition, specifically cannabis prohibition, I mean, alcohol prohibition, I think only lasted, 13 years or something? But, cannabis prohibition, it seems to have stood the test of time. We can say anecdotally beneficial, but we all know that it is. I mean, we know that wine can be a beneficial, just, a nice little glass at night to help you calm down, if for no other reason. And we doctors find that beneficial for people all day long. However, we know that cannabis benefits glaucoma, cancer, potentially has cancer-fighting capabilities. Not to mention that there was a prescription that was established, and University of Mississippi had been dishing it out for quite some time. If anybody is familiar with the Patients Out of Time, there's a couple of surviving members still have that prescription, and the government still sends them 10 full of joints. It's hypocritical at this point that we don't have and have had that. It's just such a hypocritical stance that we can find ourselves in.
Yeah, and nowadays we're seeing a transformation taking place. And although at one point you would have people only smoking marijuana, and thereby the cannabinoids, particularly the THCA, once heated, either set on fire or vaporized or baked, transform into THC and would become psychoactive. So anybody who was trying to take advantage of the medication at the same time was having a psychoactive effect. But what we're finding now is that there are a lot of low THC forms of the product, and that some of the synergies, like the ones that we saw in Charlotte's Web and Haley's Hope, for example, have synergies that don't require anything psychoactive happening to the patient. And we're also, finding that there's ratios at this point, not necessarily very low THC, but having some THC is having a beneficial effect also. So, bottom line is that to find those right entourages, some of the medications are going to involve THC, and other medications are not, or have low forms of it. And we're going to see, I think, a lot less in terms of green bud medication. We're going to see more oils, we're going to see more tinctures, we're going to see more edibles, transdermal patches. We're seeing, like Mary's Medicinals, for example, transdermal patches. If you go into dispensaries, medical marijuana dispensaries, and you look in their cases and so forth, there's a great deal of products that have nothing to do with smoking marijuana.
That's an interesting point. The smoking versus just actually using it for medicinal. We're going to take a quick break. When we get back, we have Attorney Jeffrey Feiler here. Be right back at you here shortly, folks.
Stay tuned for more State of Cannabis, only on CannabisRadio.com when we return.
It's time to check in with Doc Rob and the Concierge for Better Living. We take a real, raw, inside look at healthier living while sharing great ideas and improvements for a better quality of life. The Concierge for Better Living will help informed, intrigued, and interested listeners like you make better choices for yourselves and your loved ones. The Concierge for Better Living with Doc Rob, only on CannabisRadio.com.
Candid, captivating, compelling. Welcome to Cannabis Confidential with Dr. Dina. Listen in as Dr. Dina, medical marijuana pioneer and inspiration for the award-winning TV series Weeds, shares never-before-heard stories, chats with cannabis insiders and celebrity friends, and provides invaluable perspective and insight into one of the fastest-growing industries in the world. Cannabis Confidential with Dr. Dina, only on CannabisRadio.com.
Hi, I'm Montel Williams. Most of you know me as a talk show host, but I'm also an author, actor, single father of 4, a fitness writer, avid snowboarder, and I'm also a medical marijuana patient. Like many of the million people who are living with multiple sclerosis, I'm in pain every single day. And sometimes my nerves are so raw that if you brushed up against me in an elevator, I'd scream. I can't sleep at night from the pain, and sometimes the spasms in my legs are so intense they will wake me up throughout the night. I've tried the strongest prescription medications available, and I'm going to tell you, they do not work. In fact, they leave me in a stupor, and most of the time, it's impossible to even live your life. Now, I've tried medical marijuana, and I'm going to tell you something, it works. If you'd like more information about medical marijuana, you can contact the Marijuana Policy Project at mpp.org or call 1-877-JOIN-MPP.
Chronicling the latest cannabis industry news and headlines. Welcome back to the State of Cannabis, only on CannabisRadio.com. Once again, here's Dave Inman.
Welcome back to the State of Cannabis, folks. I'm Dave Inman. With me today, we have Jeffrey Feiler, founder and CEO of GrassRoots Ventures and also GrassRootsForACure.com. That is www.grassrootsforacure.com. Jeffrey, tell me currently what would be one of the biggest thoughts on your mind at this moment as you are venturing into potentially one of the most important votes for cannabis in Florida's history?
Well, I've been speaking with some folks around these last few days, and we've all been talking about the election. What I'm seeing is this misconception, and I think that a product maybe of some of the negative advertising, but a misconception that people think that the Senate Bill 10 means that we have a medical marijuana law already, and that somehow this constitutional amendment is a recreational marijuana law. And I say, no. The whole thing is medical marijuana. We have a very limited law in effect that is really designed around childhood intractable epilepsy and THC. But it's extremely limited to just that, and that we have a constitutional amendment that's purely medical marijuana that would, basically fill in the rest of the folks out there who need the help, and this is not recreational marijuana. And how these people have come to this misconception, I'm not really sure. Like I said, I think that it may just be some misinformation by the negative folks out there that people feel that way. So, I want to certainly make it clear that that Florida is not considering a recreational marijuana act. There was a sheriff in a debate last week who basically said that if we pass this law that people are going to be smoking marijuana out on the street corners, and you just don't see that in Colorado. It doesn't work that way. This is medication. Pick it up at a very highly regulated and licensed pharmacy. You take it home and you administrate it. And this is not a recreational marijuana law.
So do you think that maybe just due to social media?
Well, I don't know whether it's social media or television media. It's an imperfect world of communication. There was one editorial in a newspaper the other day that just the way that the sentence was written led some people, including prominent people, to proclaim that the amendment had already passed. And it's like, what do you mean the amendment? Again, I meet people on the street and they said, well, I read in the newspaper the amendment had passed. And it's like, how could the amendment have passed? The election is not until next Tuesday. So, I think that, it's a matter of communication or miscommunication. But, for the purpose of, what I'm conveying here, I'd like it to be clear that the constitutional amendment is not a recreational marijuana law. It's a medical marijuana law. And the existing legislation, the Senate Bill 1030, which is under it, there's been lawsuits filed against it. It's in the administrative court system. Even if they were to get their act together with that legislation, it would be extraordinarily limited legislation, and it's just not enough. I mean, it certainly shouldn't make people think that we have a comprehensive medical marijuana law, one little baby step of a law.
Let me ask you this.
The constitutional amendment is the rest.
Let me ask you this. say that there's been a negative effect to where voters won't go out and vote?
Well, I think that some of the folks who are undecided on the issue, who are not educated about what it's all about, only have limited information, who are going into the polls thinking that if they were to vote for this, that they'd be voting for recreational marijuana, and that's something they're not ready for. They might vote no for it for all the wrong reasons.
What about if the medical isn't good enough? Like, are you having any kind of scenarios like that? Like, I know here we have a few different avenues that we're looking at. One is potentially through legislation. Another one will be through another citizens initiative. And essentially, there's people that they simply will not vote if you, for instance, don't have grow rights. Are you seeing any kind of a backlash because it simply isn't full tax and regulate?
Well, no. The constitutional amendment calls for these medical marijuana treatment centers, and the medical marijuana treatment centers, by definition, are permitted dispense as well as cultivate, as well as food, tinctures, oils, and things of that nature. So I believe if the amendments were to pass, that what's going to happen is a fully capitalistic system. There's nothing in here that calls for a not-for-profit system. I believe that stores and growing operations and extracting operations and so forth be permitted and will occur in Florida.
And hopefully they do it in a reputable manner, and they do stuff that promotes and promulgates safe use. We're just about out of time. Jeff, I really want to thank you for your time tonight. Anything you'd like to say?
Well, thank you. Well, just to segue off of the last thing that was said, and that is anything that our company does in terms of a retail operation is going to be a top quality retail operation, staff who are fully educated and who are in a position to educate to the best of knowledge that's out there. To the extent that we're involved in any type of cultivation operations, it's going to be organic medication with no pesticides and with all of the right systems, because what's being delivered here is medication to the foundation, that we can put something back into our community by helping people. The whole thing is supposed to be symbiotic in the sense that we want to have good quality of everything across the board and also benefit the community in the process.
It's crazy. I always hear such negative things about lawyers. Thank you, Jeff, for everything that you do, that you're doing, and that you're about to do. Again, everybody, that is GrassRootsForACure.com, or if you just need a really good lawyer in Florida or Colorado, Attorney Jeffrey Feiler. That brings us to a conclusion of another edition of The State of Cannabis. Have a happy and safe Halloween, folks. I'm your host, Dave Inman. Have a wonderful night.
The opinions expressed on this CannabisRadio.com program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of CannabisRadio.com. Any rebroadcast or redistribution without proper consent of CannabisRadio.com is prohibited.